The first thing that made me suspicious was not the crying. Yoruba people cry loudly at funerals. Especially in Alife. The women beat their chests. The elderly men lowered their caps and shook their heads. The talking drum spoke sorrow into the humid morning air. That part was normal. What was not normal was the coffin. It was too light. I noticed it the moment 4 young men lifted it onto their shoulders. They carried it across the red earth of our ancestral compound with the ease of men carrying an empty basket. I watched their steps closely. There was no strain in their shoulders, no careful balance that a heavy load demands. They walked almost too smoothly, the way you walk when carrying something hollow. Nobody else seemed to notice. Nobody except me. And that was strange, because the coffin supposedly carried my father, a grown man, a chief, someone who had filled every room he ever entered. I stood beneath a black umbrella as the first clouds gathered above our compound, and I told myself I was only imagining things. But the feeling did not leave. It sat in my chest like a stone, heavy in the exact way the coffin was not. The man inside that coffin, or who should have been inside it, was Chief Adewale Adebayo. My father. The man who raised me alone after my mother died when I was only 4 years old. His ancestors had lived in Alife for generations, since the days when Oodua was said to have first set his feet upon this land. My father carried that history with quiet pride, never boasting, only reminding me gently that we belonged to something larger than ourselves. He had spent his life teaching me that a person's character was worth more than any inheritance. He was not a rich man by city standards, yet in Alife, where land and lineage mattered more than money, people lowered their voices when he entered a room. My name is Colonel Adebayo. I am his only son. On that morning, surrounded by mourners, I felt like the only person in our family compound who was not crying, because I was too busy thinking, too busy watching that light coffin disappear slowly toward the open grave. Something was wrong. I could not yet say what. But I knew, the way a son simply knows things about his own father, that this was not right. My father used to say, "Colonel, remember this. The eye may be small, but it sees farther than the ear." He meant that what you witness with your own eyes is worth more than every story people whisper to you. He never explained things directly. He wrapped his wisdom inside proverbs and left me to unwrap them on my own. Before we continue, if stories like this inspire you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Also, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach and connecting with viewers from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. Standing there at the burial, I finally understood what he meant. Everyone around me was listening to what people said. Nobody was looking at what their own eyes could see. The talking drums beat on. An old praise singer walked slowly around the open grave, chanting my father's full lineage, naming his father, and his father's father, all the way back through generations who had farmed this same red soil. With each name, elders nodded, confirming that this man truly belonged to this earth. The land beneath our feet was not ordinary land. Selling such land without family consent would be a disgrace beyond imagining. And yet, 2 days before the funeral, I had found a folded paper in my father's desk, a paper in Victor's handwriting, mentioning a company interested in purchasing the Eastern family land, pending finalization. After the burial, mourners gathered in the compound to eat and comfort one another, as is our custom. Plates of jollof rice, pounded yam, and goat meat stew were passed around. Old women hugged me and told me how strong I looked, how proud my father would have been. I thanked them with my mouth, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the lightness of that coffin again and again. I watched my cousin Victor move through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting condolences with a practiced bow of his head. He thanked people for coming. He spoke of my father's kindness in a voice that trembled just enough to seem sincere. To anyone who did not know him closely, he looked like a grieving nephew. But I had grown up beside Victor. I knew the difference between his real laugh and his careful one. That afternoon, every word out of his mouth was a careful voice, measured, polished, performed for whoever was watching. He had managed my father's business affairs for the past year. He had called the doctor. He had arranged the burial date, faster than tradition usually allows. I filed these facts away quietly, the way my father had taught me to notice small, important things. Late that night, after the last mourners had gone home and the compound had finally fallen silent, I sat alone on the veranda where my father used to drink his evening tea. The chair still smelled faintly of him. I thought about the folded paper in his desk. I thought about how quickly the burial had been arranged, far sooner than was proper for a man of his standing. I thought about the coffin, light as an empty basket, carried without effort by 4 young men. None of it fit together the way grief alone should explain. I did not say anything to anyone that night. I simply sat with my questions, listening to the rain begin against the roof, the same rain that had fallen as we lowered the coffin into the earth. I did not know it then, but before the next moon rose over the hills of Ife, I would discover that my father's death was built on lies. And those lies stretched back further than anyone imagined, even further than the old family compound where generations of Adebayos had lived and died. To understand what happened next, you must first understand the man my father was, and the land he refused to ever let go. I was named in this very compound, 26 years before that funeral. On the 7th day after my birth, my father held a naming ceremony beneath the same mango tree where, years later, he would argue about football with his friends. Elders sat in a circle. Honey was placed on my tongue so that my life would be sweet. Salt was placed there too, so that I would understand both the sweetness and the sharpness of life. Kola nut was placed in my small hands by my grandfather, though I was too young to remember it myself. My father told me the story so many times that it became my own memory. Iku ojo mito sir, visitors would say to my father whenever they had not seen him for a few days, a respectful greeting acknowledging the days that had passed. Respect for elders was never optional in our house. It was the floor beneath every conversation we ever had. That mango tree would witness many important moments in our family's life. My naming, my father's teachings, and one day, a gathering that would change everything. My father raised me alone after my mother died. He never remarried, saying a man who truly loved his wife did not simply replace her. Instead, he poured everything into raising me well. In the evenings, after his work was finished, he would sit with me under the mango tree, a kettle of hot water and a small cup of gari between us, and he would teach. Connor, a child who is not taught by his mother will be taught by the world. And the world is not gentle. Sometimes, instead of proverbs, he simply told stories. He told me about the Uni's palace, where as a young man he had once carried messages between elders during a festival, close enough to see the beaded crown himself. He told me about Oodua, the great ancestor said to have descended from the sky to found Ife, and how every family compound in our town carried a small piece of that ancient story inside it. We do not just live in Alife, he told me once. Alife lives inside us too. I did not always understand him then. I understand him completely now. My father taught me about our ancestral land the way other fathers taught their sons about money. The land sat on the outskirts of Alife, bordering older family holdings that had belonged to our lineage since the time of our great-grandfathers. To outsiders, it looked like ordinary farmland. Rows of cassava, a few orange trees, red soil baked hard by the sun. To us, it was history. It was identity. It was proof that our ancestors had once walked this very earth and built something that outlived them. Never sell what you did not build alone, my father told me once, while we walked the boundary of that land together. This soil remembers every Adebayo who has touched it. If you sell it, you sell their memory too. He showed me the old boundary stones, half buried in grass, placed there by hands long gone. He showed me where his own father had taught him to plant cassava, and where, as a boy, he had buried a tooth beneath an orange tree for good luck. I did not know then how soon I would need to remember every word of that lesson. My cousin Victor grew up differently. His branch of the family had less land and less luck. His own father, my father's younger brother, had sold off most of his portion years earlier to pay debts, a decision my father never fully forgave. When Victor's father passed away, my father took Victor in as if he were his own son. He paid for Victor's schooling. He gave him work managing the family's small trading business. He trusted him with the account books, the receipts, the careful balance of money in and money out. I noticed, even as a boy, the way Victor looked at our land sometimes. Not with love, but with calculation, the way a trader looks at goods he wishes he could afford. Once, when we were teenagers, Victor told me quietly, "Your father has more land than he can use. One day, somebody in this family will be smart enough to use it properly." I did not understand what he meant then. I understood it perfectly the day we buried that coffin. Palm wine gatherings were where I learned the most. My father's friends, old farmers, retired teachers, a respected herbalist, would sit with him under the mango tree on slow evenings, passing a single gourd of palm wine between them, laughing about decisions made decades ago. I remember one evening especially. Paul Ogonyemi, my father's oldest friend, told the story of how our great-grandfather had received the Eastern Land, a gift from a past owner's court, in gratitude for years of loyal service. "That land does not belong to one man," Paul Ogonyemi said, raising his gourd. "It belongs to every Adibeo who has not yet been born." Victor sat just outside the circle of elders that evening, listening but rarely invited to speak. I noticed his jaw tighten whenever the men spoke proudly of land he did not own. As we grew older, Victor became skilled at appearing humble while quietly building influence. He learned which uncles to flatter and which to avoid. My father trusted him more each year, never imagining that the kindness he had shown a fatherless boy would one day be turned against him. That is the man they buried in a coffin too light to hold him. 3 days after the funeral, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the coffin, about the folded paper in the desk, and about the strange speed with which everything had happened. In our tradition, important decisions are not rushed. Funerals are planned carefully. Land matters are discussed slowly, with every family elder given the chance to speak. Yet my father had been buried only 4 days after his death, far sooner than was proper for a man of his standing. Victor had insisted it was what my father wanted. But my father had never once mentioned wanting a quick, quiet burial. He had always spoken of wanting a funeral that honored his ancestors properly, with enough time for distant relatives to travel home. Lying awake, I began to separate what I actually knew from what I had simply been told. The list of things I truly knew was short. The list of things Victor had told me was long. My father's own words echoed in my mind, "The eye sees farther than the ear." I decided, that night, that it was time to start looking instead of listening. I decided to visit my father's oldest friend, Paul Ogonyemi, a retired schoolteacher who had known my father since they were boys. He lived in a small house near the edge of town, surrounded by books and old photographs. "Colonel," he said, before I had even finished greeting him, "I wondered when you would come." He told me things I did not know. In the weeks before his death, my father had visited him twice, looking worried. My father had told him that Victor was pressuring him to sign papers related to the Eastern Land, papers my father refused to sign, because the land was not his alone to give away. It belonged to the entire family, held in trust for future generations. "Your father suspected something was wrong with his food," Paul Ogonyemi said quietly. He told me his stomach burned every evening, after Victor brought him his tea. I felt my chest tighten. My father had taught me that the eye sees farther than the ear, and yet he had not seen what was happening to him until it was almost too late. I thanked Paul Ogonyemi and left, my mind racing toward the palace registry, where the true land records were kept. I needed proof, not suspicion. The next morning, I went to the palace area of Ilife, where official records of ancestral land were kept by a registrar who worked closely with matters concerning the Oni's court. Walking toward the palace grounds, I passed the great courtyard where festivals were held every year, where as a boy I had watched masquerades dance and drummers perform for the Oni himself. It felt strange to be approaching the same palace not for celebration, but for evidence. I greeted the palace guards respectfully, removed my cap as custom required, and waited almost an hour before the registrar was free to see me. The registrar, an elderly man who recognized my father's name immediately, pulled out a dusty file. Inside was the original boundary agreement, signed by my great-grandfather, stating clearly that the land could never be sold without the agreement of every living family head, not just the eldest son, not just whoever managed the paperwork. My family had registered our land boundaries there decades earlier, a tradition many old Ife families still honored, since the palace had long served as a keeper of history for the descendants of Oodua. Then the registrar showed me something else. A more recent document, filed only 2 months earlier, requesting a boundary survey in preparation for transfer of ownership. The name on the request was Victor's. My hands were shaking by the time I left the palace grounds. Victor had no right to request such a survey alone. The boundary agreement my great-grandfather had signed made that very clear. Yet here it was, his signature, his request, dated weeks before my father's health began to fail. I walked home slowly, turning the discovery over in my mind. Victor had not simply hoped to inherit a share of land someday. He had been actively preparing to sell it, secretly, while my father was still alive and still refusing to agree. That meant my father's refusal had stood directly in Victor's way. And men who stand in the way of plans already in motion sometimes find themselves removed from the picture entirely. I did not want to believe it. But the paper in my hand did not care what I wanted to believe. I returned home and searched my father's study more carefully. Behind a stack of old newspapers, I found a small notebook in my father's handwriting. The final pages, written shakily, were different from his usual neat script. Victor wants the eastern land for the company men from Ibadan. I told him no. He says I am old and foolish. He brings me tea every evening now, more than before. My stomach burns. I do not understand why. The last entry, dated only 5 days before his death, said simply, if something happens to me, Connor must check the papers in the palace registry. He must not let the land go. I sat with that notebook for a long time, the rain tapping gently on the roof, the weight of the truth settling over me like a heavy cloth. My father had known. He had tried to protect what mattered, even as his strength left him. And Victor, the cousin my father had raised like a son, had been the one taking it from him, 1 cup of tea at a time. I did not sleep that night either. Instead, I made a list of everyone who might help me confirm what I now suspected. The family doctor who had signed the death certificate, the elders who would need to see the evidence, and my father's lawyer in town, a quiet, careful man named Mr. Bango. The next morning, I visited Mr. Bango's small office above a fabric shop near the market. When I showed him the registry papers and explained what Pa Ogonyemi had told me, he removed his glasses slowly and rubbed his eyes. Your father came to me too, he admitted. 3 weeks before he died. He wanted to change his will, to make sure the eastern land could never be sold by one person alone, no matter what position they held in the family. I told him I would prepare the papers. He died before I could bring them to him for his signature. This was the final piece I needed. Victor had known my father was planning to lock the land away from him for good. Whatever Victor had done, he had done it quickly, before that protection could be put in place. I asked my uncles to call a family gathering, early, on the 30th day. In Yoruba tradition, 40 days after a death, the family gathers again, not to mourn a second time, but to settle matters of inheritance, land, and respect, with elders presiding over the discussion. Public disgrace at such a meeting follows a person for the rest of their life. I asked for the gathering to be held early, saying only that there were urgent matters concerning the land. Victor agreed readily, perhaps believing it would simply confirm his control over family affairs. The gathering was held beneath the mango tree, the same place where I had been named, where my father had taught me proverbs, where palm wine had been shared for decades. Elders sat according to rank, the oldest closest to the center. Men wore agbada in deep blue and white. Women wore oak wrappers with matching geli tied high on their heads. Trays of kola nut were passed around first, as custom required. The eldest uncle broke a kola nut, offered a piece to the ground for our ancestors, and prayed for wisdom and clear eyes for everyone present. I had never wanted clear eyes more badly in my life. Victor sat near the front, calm and confident, greeting elders with practiced respect. A small group of talking drummers sat to one side, though they did not play. This was not yet a moment for celebration. When it was time to speak, I stood, my hands trembling slightly, and greeted the elders properly before I began. My father taught me that the eye sees farther than the ear, I said. For many days, I listened to what people told me about his death. Today, I would like to show you what my eyes have seen. I read from my father's notebook. I described his burning stomach, his fear, his final written wish. I held up the copy of the palace registry document, the boundary agreement requiring full family approval, and the recent survey request bearing Victor's name. I explained the folded paper from the desk, the company from a burden, the unusual speed of the burial. The compound grew very quiet. Even the chickens seemed to stop their noise. Every elder's eyes moved from the papers in my hand to Victor's face, watching closely for what he would do. Mr. Banco, who had agreed to attend at my request, stood next and confirmed that my father had visited him only weeks before his death, asking for the land to be protected from sale by any single family member. A man does not ask for such protection, Mr. Banco said, unless he fears someone is already trying to take it. Victor stood, his composure cracking. These are lies. An old man's confused writing. A misunderstanding about paperwork. But poor Ogonyemi rose next, his voice steady despite his age. Your father came to me, Victor, frightened, weeks before he died. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. One of the eldest uncles, a man with a voice like thunder despite his small frame, demanded that the registrar's documents be examined properly by the family lawyer that very week. Another elder asked Victor directly why a survey request had been filed for land he did not own, under a name that was not his to use. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no proverb wise enough to answer that question. By the end of the gathering, the elders had reached their decision. Victor was stripped of his role managing the family's affairs. He would no longer be welcome to represent the Adebayo name at family functions. Whether the matter of my father's death would be pursued through the proper authorities was left for the family lawyer and the police to determine. But the disgrace among our people, the loss of trust, the loss of standing, had already been delivered, swiftly and completely, in front of everyone who mattered. Victor left the compound that evening without looking at anyone. I felt no joy watching him go. Only a tired, hollow sadness, the kind that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. As the sun set, the talking drummers finally began to play. Not a celebration song, but a quiet, steady rhythm, the kind played to honor a difficult truth that has finally come to light. I walked home that night past the boundary stones my father had once shown me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight in my chest begin to ease. 1 year later, I sat beneath the old Iroko tree at the edge of our family land, the same eastern land Victor had tried to take. Children ran through the small scholarship center we had built there in my father's name, their laughter drifting across the evening air while the distant sound of talking drums echoed from the town center, practicing for an upcoming festival. The center offered school fees and books to children from families who could not otherwise afford them, exactly the kind of help my father had quietly given to people throughout his life, without ever speaking of it. I watched a young girl, no older than 7, carry her new exercise book proudly under one arm, the way I imagine I once carried my own. The land Victor had tried to sell to strangers now belonged to the future of our whole community. My father would have liked that very much. The case against Victor moved slowly through the proper authorities, as such matters often do. But within our family and within Alife itself, the truth was already known and already settled. He no longer attended gatherings beneath the mango tree. His name was rarely spoken, and when it was spoken quietly, the way people speak of a lesson learned the hard way. Some of my younger cousins still asked questions about him, curious in the way children are curious about anything left unexplained. I answered them simply, a man forgot that land and trust are not things one person can take for himself, no matter how clever his plans. I did not feel hatred when I thought of Victor anymore. Only a quiet sorrow for the boy he had once been, the one who sat outside the circle of elders, watching land he could not have. In Yoruba tradition, people do not truly die when their bodies leave this world. They live on through the lives they touch, through their children, through their deeds, through the stories people continue to tell. I understood this now in a way I never had before. My father's voice still guided me, not because I imagined it, but because every proverb he had taught me had become part of how I saw the world. The eye may be small, but it sees farther than the ear. I thought of this often. It was not only advice about land or lies. It was advice about life itself, about paying attention, about trusting what was real over what was simply said, about honoring the people who came before us by protecting what they built. Every evening I spent beneath that Iroko tree felt like another small conversation with him, even though he could no longer answer back. I visited the palace registry again that year, not out of suspicion this time, but out of respect. I added my own name beneath my father's in the family record, confirming that the eastern land would remain under the protection of every living Adebayo, just as my great-grandfather had intended generations earlier. Poor Ogonyemi came to visit the scholarship center on its opening day, leaning on his walking stick, smiling at the rows of children seated under a canopy listening to their first lesson. "Your father used to say that wisdom survives longer than money," he told me, squeezing my shoulder. "Look around you, Connor. This is what survives." Some evenings, I still catch myself reaching for the small notebook, the one with my father's shaking final words. I no longer need to read it to remember what it says. I keep it now not as evidence, but as a piece of him, proof that even at his weakest, he had thought first of protecting what our ancestors had built. As the sun sank beyond the ancient hills of Alife, painting the sky in soft orange and deep red, I finally understood what my father had spent his entire life teaching me. Truth moves slowly. Lies can run fast, hiding behind rushed funerals and forged papers and forced tears. But truth, patient and steady, always catches up in the end. It never loses its way. I poured a small cup of palm wine onto the red earth beneath the Iroko tree, the way the elders taught us to honor those who came before. The soil drank it in quietly, the same way it had drunk in the footsteps of every Adebayo before me. Somewhere in the distance, the talking drums continued their steady rhythm, carrying my father's story, and now my own, into the evening air of Alife. What do you think about this story? Did justice finally prevail, or should the characters have handled things differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next captivating tale. Also, share this video with your friends and family. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.